Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
This is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now within Freedom Now
Abarigani, this is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, September 24th, 2022. We commence with our sister, Luyanda Kaboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Kehinde Andrews, professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University in Great Britain, and author of the book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Then, later in the hour, our Indigenous elder, scholar activist, and author, Ward Churchill, returns to Freedom Now, this time in dialogue with Dr. Gerald Horne about the two books he co-authored, which are out now in reprint. They are Agents of Repression, the FBI's Secret Wars Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, and the COINTELPRO Papers, documents from the FBI's Secret Wars Against Dissent in the United States. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, John Coltrane, who would have been 96 years old yesterday, September 23rd, happy birthday, Miles Davis, Art Blakey, Thelonious Monk, Donald Harrison, The Sungate, Blackfoot Confederacy, Cusco, Laiole Aleluya, and J. Cole. So sit back, tell a friend, and as always we stand, ready for revolution.
And with that get overstanding, and knowledge shall be added unto thee. On your way up, be good to those people you met, like you would have meet the same people.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Kaboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of Tuesday, September 26th. This presentation will highlight significant progressive revolutionary activists and events in the struggle for humanity and spirituality over greed and the ruling class. September 28, 1958, Guinea, West Africa votes no, not only to French colonialism, but votes no to any economic and political ties to France, thereby proclaiming a complete independence from European rule. This mass decision set in motion the development of the most revolutionary African microstate in Africa, laying the groundwork for the development of Pan-Africanism as an objective and ideology of Nkrumahism to racism. September 29, 1965, CIA and its puppets overthrow the progressive democratic government in Indonesia of Sukarno and murder over 500,000 people. Indonesia composes of over 18,110 islands and is the world's largest Muslim country, targeted due to its multitude of natural resources. September 30th, 1975, the military dictatorship called the Derg declares a state of emergency and seizes control over the Ethiopian government, imprisoning His Majesty Haile Selassie Jah and slaughtering students, intellectuals, and trade unionists, ending the longest rule of an emperor in Africa. October 1st, 1949. China, one of the poorest and most divided countries in the world, is liberated under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. After 30 years of armed struggle, thereby liberating women, peasants, and working class from centuries of stagnant development. October 2nd, 1800. Nat Turner was born the week before Gabriel Prosser, a well-known rebellious slave leader, was hanged. Nat Turner, a gifted child, believed that God spoke to him directly and commanded him to lead African people to destroy the system of slavery. Nat Turner used religion as a weapon of revolution. October 2nd, 1858, Queen Mary Thomas, was born. She was an African slave rebellion leader in St. Croix, which is part of the U.S. colony in the Virgin Islands today. On October 1st, 1878, she and two other slave women, Rebecca Frederick and Exeline Solomon, aka the Black Amazon, led a revolt and killed many whites and set fire to the plantation houses of white slave owners, which also freed many slaves. October 3rd, 1952. The Mau Mau Rebellion against the British colonial rule in Kenya, East Africa begins. The Mau Mau's major targets were African collaborators with the British, thus beginning the class struggle, which has intensified throughout Africa and the diaspora. The Mau Mau correctly understood that without collaborationists, England could not maintain colonial rule. October 3rd, 1904. The people of Namibia, formerly called Southwest Africa, begin armed struggle against German colonial rule, evolving into total liberation under the leadership of Southwest African People's Organization. This has been Freedom Now at 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Central California. Freedom Now's mission statement and profile is on the web at kpfk.org under programs. We hope that these reminders of bygone struggle will motivate those in the listening audience not to get frustrated with the slow pace of change. We have a rich history of struggle that has moved world society forward. We appreciate your participation in the upcoming fund drive, October 10th to 22nd. We would like to have a unity chant of Amandla Awetu, which means all power to the people. So join us as we chant Amandla in response Awetu. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Professor Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University in Great Britain, and author of the book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Andrews.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, The New Age of Empire?
So the book really turned out to be a prequel to my previous book, which was Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, where in that book, I'm kind of arguing we need a revolution and we need to do this revolutionary politics. But having taught that book and discussed to people, it became really obvious that people really need to understand what the problem was before the solution. And so I just felt like, look, to understand this system, you have to understand that racism is at its very core. It is what makes the West the West. It is the thing which underpins absolutely everything. And so in order to get people to the solution, I thought, well, let's write a book about the problem. And then nobody will be any doubt that we actually need the revolutionary politics.
I see. And in that context, you discussed the United States, particularly MAGA, Make America Great Again, the emblem of one Donald J. Trump and his 75 million followers. You say that represents colonial nostalgia. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have this as well, where we're in a moment where, because of immigration and because of, you know, successful civil rights movements, you have more black faces, right? You have black studies, you have black professors, you have black presidents in America. And so this makes many white people resentful and think that things have changed and kind of they want to go back to when it was all white, right? Back to white supremacy. And that's what that Make America Great Again is, as though it was great when everything was white. And now it's a little bit blacker. People are kind of yearning for the old days. But my point about the book generally is that it may look a bit different, but to be honest, it really isn't. The same logic underpins it, even though you're seeing more black representation in higher spaces.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also use the phrase racial patriarchy. What does that phrase mean to you?
I think the key thing with racial patriarchy is to think about, again, how race is... This is something my late wife, actually, my wife died a few months ago, and Dr. Nicole Andrews, thank you. And she talked about blackness and racism as being like the roundabout, you have roundabout, like rotary, I think, the junction, if you like, in America, where everything goes through it. And so we think about patriarchy, there is this kind of white feminist way to look at patriarchy where, you know, there's men and there's women and it's that simple. Actually, no, race intersects with patriarchy and creates completely different relations. And so when we're thinking about patriarchy, you have to think about race underpinning how patriarchy works. And that plays out very differently for black men, black women, white women, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also have a critique of the Enlightenment, this movement of 18th century Europe predominantly, that even in the 21st century is taught, at least in US schools, as this great leap forward for humanity. That's what students are taught. Mm-hmm. But to the contrary, you say on page 7, early on, that the Enlightenment was an exemplar of white identity politics. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The Enlightenment is supposed to be this new dawn, this revolutionary process, etc., etc. If you think about race, and if you accept that racism is the kind of fundamental thing about the West, what happens in the Enlightenment is, if it was this great leap forward, you would expect science, evidence to mean that racism gets less, right? Racism disappears. Actually, it's the complete opposite. Prior to the Enlightenment, you have this idea that we're inferior because we don't have souls, we're not Christians. It's in the Enlightenment that you really have this scientific view that me and you are not really human beings, that we're closer to animals, where they basically pretend they create the evidence to prove this. And why I say it's white identity politics is the basic conceit of the Enlightenment, people like Immanuel Kant, is that the white people have all the talents of the world. The white people are the people who can understand and see and are the best and are the most rational. But this is only possible because in the 15th century, when Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue, Europeans are behind everywhere. They're probably the only part of the world in a dark age. And it takes 200 years of untold colonial violence to erase the Americas, to depopulate and destroy Africa, to bring down Asian societies, for people like Immanuel Kant to be in the position to say, look, we're the best, right? We're the top. And so why I say it's identity politics, it's this conceit that whiteness is right, whiteness is knowledge, whiteness is science. But it's all built on this centuries of colonial violence to get to that place in the first place.
Now, you mentioned Immanuel Kant, and you talk about his violent and ugly racist past. I'm wondering if you would describe other exemplars of the Enlightenment, such as David Hume, for example, such as Rousseau, for example. Mm-hmm. Would you describe them similarly?
Yeah, I mean, Kant's just the most obvious. I mean, Immanuel Kant is somebody who actually, and it's in the book, the quote where he's advising slave owners that the best way to beat us is with a split bamboo cane rather than a whip. because our skin is too thick. So our split bamboo cane is the best way to beat an African. I mean, he's so bad, he's just the best example. But Locke, Rousseau, Hume, Jefferson, all of them, they're all in Voltaire. All of them have the same basic premise behind their racial theory, which is black people at the bottom, white people at the top. And it's for white people who can be rational. And that underpins all Enlightenment thought, which is why all Enlightenment thought is fundamentally racist at its very basis.
Now, moving across the planet, you also discussed Australia. And in that context, you discuss the plight over the centuries of the indigenous population of Australia, oftentimes referred to as the Aboriginal population. Mm-hmm. And you suggest that the European authorities there were seeking to, quote, breed them out of existence, unquote. What does that mean?
Yeah, so when the British went to Australia, they discovered people only exist when white people see them, right? So they find the Aborigines, and all settler colonies are genocidal by nature. They want to get rid of the population. You need to get rid of everybody. And there was the theory that because the Aborigines were a feeble people, and we have Darwin making these arguments about the feeble races dying out, that they'd all die out, right? And they didn't all die out. So they actually had a policy of removing children from families, of even raping the maids and then had in houses and then taking those offspring away. There was a very clear pattern of trying to actually say, well, if we can't kill them off violently, can we just breed them out of existence and make sure they're completely and utterly erased? But that is the logic of all settler colonies eventually, is that you have to exterminate the people who are there so that you can take over. And in the United States, you see there's similar things in terms of like removing children, particularly in places like Canada, et cetera. But the basic logic is you have to get rid of the population. And there's different ways you can do that.
Speaking of which, there's a rather heart-rending Australian film that I would recommend to our audience entitled Rabbit-Proof Fence that deals with what you just described in a dramatization. And I highly recommend it. And in fact, since I'm on that theme of films down under, I would also, in addition to Rabbit-Proof Fence, recommend The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. I'd recommend from New Zealand, Utu, U-T-U, which has some of the most powerful and potent scenes of Black resistance ever committed to celluloid. Now, moving on, with regard to the Holocaust, this process whereby German Nazis and their comrades systematically murdered approximately 6 million Jewish people in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, in addition to political dissidents and religious dissidents as well. You argued that the Holocaust was no aberration. Your term. What do you mean by that?
Well, the typical way we think of the Holocaust is that, there was evil people in Germany, these horrible racists, they came to power because we enabled them. And we should never forget this, and we should make sure this never happens again. And actually, in fact, even the idea of race itself, up until the Holocaust, racial science was perfectly accepted. It was in all the universities. We have University College London here, Francis Galton, who's the founder of eugenics, right? The idea that there are feeble races and Africans at the bottom, etc., etc. All that was totally, utterly accepted. The Nazis weren't actually an aberration. The science which underpins it, the ideas which underpin it, are clearly embedded in colonial practice, in Western thought, in America, in France, in Britain. I mean, even Winston Churchill, the person who apparently won the war, complete eugenicist, right? Shared very, very, very similar views of people like Hitler, etc. And so when we look back and think that the Holocaust was an aberration, we miss the point. Actually, there's a great book by Zygmunt Bauman, Modernity and the Holocaust, where he says that actually it's only in Western modernity could you have something like the Holocaust. One, you have this concept of race, that there are races who are not really human beings, who are disposable. And we've seen that. And it's Césaire who talks about the boomerang effect, right? So you see the way that we can be erased in the Americas, you see that we could be enslaved, etc., etc. And what the Holocaust is the boomerang effect. It's that coming into Europe with people we think of as white, and then we all go, oh my God, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. But actually, the Holocaust, if you put it in its continuum of colonial atrocities, it doesn't stand out, right? It's terrible, but it's not more terrible than 10 million people who are killed in Congo, by Leopold is not more terrible than the 65 million plus natives in the Americas who were killed. So we should see it actually as a continuum, as a logic of what the West is: race, science, technology, and genocide. And you can see that for the last 500 years, really.
And of course, the genocide that the precursors of the German Nazis committed in Southwest Africa, Namibia, against the Nama and Herero people. And of course, Berlin, as we speak, is resisting reparations to the descendants of those victims of German genocide. And speaking of which, you also talk about foreign aid from London and Washington, oftentimes depicted as a kind of giveaway to Africa in particular. But you argue otherwise. What is your argument?
Well, I mean, the basic logic of foreign aid is that there are countries who are rich enough who have the money to give to poorer countries, right? And now, if you just look at any map of global inequality, you will see very clearly the poorest countries by wealth are the black countries in so-called sub-Saharan Africa. The richest are the white countries. We've literally built the world in the image of white supremacy. So the basic premise of it, that America, the Western countries, should have the money in the first place to give in foreign aid is the problem, right? Because that's actually about racial exploitation and racial capitalism, that we have the money in the first place, right? So we shouldn't be thankful. The idea we should be thankful that we get pennies back of money exploited from us is deeply problematic. And then when you look at actually how foreign aid functions, not all of it. I don't want to say all foreign aid's bad, because obviously, like, what we tend to do is treat the symptoms and not the problem. And the symptoms are terrible because people are dying, children are dying. So look, you want to build a well or you want to do malaria relief. These aren't bad things. But if you actually look at so much of the money that gets spent on foreign aid, it's going to Western corporations. It's going to things like, I mean, in the book, I talk about Adam Smith International, where £90 million of the foreign aid budget has gone into a private British consultancy, which is basically telling Nigeria to privatize its electricity grid. And the result of that has been that electricity is worse and it's more expensive, right? That's what actually, if you look at most of the foreign aid, it's actually terrible in practice. So in principle, it makes no sense. And in practice, most of it's actually about making those problems and dependency worse, which is the problem in the first place. Foreign aid isn't a solution. Reparations would be a solution, but foreign aid and reparations are completely distinct concepts.
And you also use the concept out of Du Bois of wages of whiteness. How do you use that in your book?
So I mean, I think this is important for Du Bois because I think one of the things which happened recently is because of the financial crash, particularly, we've seen, and because of neoliberalism, we've seen some of the conditions boomerang back, like Césaire says. So austerity, privatization, all the things we've seen in the former colonies are now happening here. And so there is a real feeling that the West is losing, that there's something happening, the poor whites are doing just as badly, etc., etc., etc. And I use this idea of wages of whiteness because Du Bois reminds us that this wage is a real thing, right? That psychological wage of whiteness, the idea that you do have privilege. Even the poorest white person in the UK or in America has privilege. It's not made up. It's not imagined. There is a real privilege. And this is why people cling to it. So the idea that you can just, the left has this idea that, look, if you just say everybody's all in the same boat, it's not true. It's not true psychologically. It's also not true materially. Like the conditions in Britain or in America, for most people, you could certainly make the case that the African American ghettos is the third world, certainly. But outside of that, it isn't the third world. You have a welfare state, you have some protections, you have the poorest people here. Like in the poorest people in the UK are probably in the top 80% of earners in the entire world, right? We don't have any understanding of what the conditions are like for most people. And that's, for me, not a psychological wage. It's actually a real economic wage, right? There are advantages to being born in the West and to being white. And we shouldn't forget that. We're not all in the same boat at all.
Finally, Professor Andrews of Birmingham City University in the UK, author of the book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Ruled the World. At the beginning of our talk, you mentioned that you had written a book with regard to revolution, and you see the book we're discussing as a prequel, which brings us to the logical next question. What next for Professor Andrews?
So the next book's already written, and this, in fact, I haven't written these two books. So this I don't know if the third book's necessarily a sequel, but it does come out of the conversations I've had in the public realm around racism, around whiteness, etc., etc. And it's so irrational. Like when you talk in public and when you talk to, particularly in the media, the discourse is so irrational, it's so delusional that whiteness can only really be compared to a psychosis. Like there's no rational base to it. Evidence doesn't matter. And if you go back to the Enlightenment conversation, right? Like you have countless evidence that would totally not only disregard the idea that white people are the only people who are rational. Like countless amounts of evidence in terms of historical, in terms of contemporary, and the reason that doesn't get taken in through the scientific lens is because actually it's not, whiteness isn't about rationality, right? It's totally devoid of rationality. And so the book that's coming out next year is called The Psychosis of Whiteness, where I argue very clearly that it is basically pointless to try to convince people to not be racist. Like, and it also comes out of reading a lot of the more newer literature, I think, on anti-racism, particularly after Black Lives Matter, where racism just gets reduced to this individual thing where you can, there's even like self-help books on racism now, like you can think we just completely misunderstood whiteness, right? Whiteness is produced by this political economic system which has white supremacy at its core. You cannot teach out whiteness. The only way to get rid of whiteness is revolution. This is the basic themes of all the books. The only way to get rid of whiteness is a revolution. And we should stop wasting our time trying to convince people to change, because we've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. Believe me, that's not the route out of the situation that we're in.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University in the UK and author of the book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
Now we go to our prison radio commentary segment, bringing the voices of our incarcerated sisters and brothers out here into the public debate.
Hey, this is Kenneth Zamorone calling from Wabash Valley Correctional Facility in Carlisle, Indiana. This is called Turning 31. Turning 31, and today I spent half my life in a draconian prison. At 16, I immediately learned to fight for state-issued food. At 17, I learned I was mature enough for 100 years in the IDOC. At 18, I became a full-fledged member of one of the most dangerous Latino gangs. I had no hope. At 19, I was placed in the secured housing unit, known as the SHU. At 20, people started to forget about me in the free world. Prisoners became my family. At 21, I was sent back to the secured housing unit, the SHU. At 22, I started to examine my life, and like Socrates stated, I learned that an unexamined life is not worth living. At 23, I knew regret and grief. At 24, a rare disease started to affect my body. At 25, I truly started to learn to read and write and fight for my rights. At 26, I truly wanted a different life. At 27, I became a full-fledged dropout of one of the most dangerous Latino gangs in the IDOC. At 28, I started to learn law. At 29, I filed a federal lawsuit. At 30, I won a federal lawsuit. At 31, I accepted fate that I may die in prison, but I will nonetheless attempt to live a meaningful life. And I will continue to fight for my rights and others. while I'm in the IDOC. Today I'm 31.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
This is Sheikh Bilal Abdul Salam Bey, an inmate at the Hutchinson Correctional Facility in Hutchinson, Kansas. This piece is called Unsanitary Practices. On 7/7/2012, while working in the Airmark kitchen and cleaning behind the counter, I witnessed 16 live maggots crawling behind the counter on the floor, as well as live mouse and roaches. This facility and the conditions that we have to eat under are very unsanitary. They're inconclusive to our health and safety. And I am asking all that are concerned to please start contacting the facility here in Kansas, as well as the Secretary of Corrections, whose name is Jeff Zamuda. His address is 714 Southwest Jackson Street, Topeka, Kansas, 66612. Also contact Warden Dan Snur at the Hutchinson Correctional Facility, and the address for here is 500 Reformatory Road, Hutchinson, Kansas, 67504. I need as much support as possible to try to get health inspectors in to do a health inspection of the cell houses as well as the kitchen, because there is mold on the walls and in the ceiling in the kitchen area. There's also holes in the wall where mice come through. There's cracks in the floor that whenever we mop, there's standing water and food that sits for days until it dries up, and it leaves a foul smell. Also, in the cell houses, there's mold and food and things on the wall. The plumbing in a lot of the cells is messed up to where the toilets spit up by themselves, and everything that had ever been inside the toilet, including feces, urine, and toilet paper, gets in the cells on the floor and runs out into the walkway and floods the whole cell house. There's not a lot of cleaning supplies that are passed out in order to correct these problems. The issues have been brought to the warden Dan Snur, yet nothing has been done about these issues. So if possible, those on the outside, please, we need your support as much as possible. Again, this is Sheikh Bilal Abdul Salam Bey. Those wishing to reach me may do so by writing Charlie Hughes, CHARLEY HUGHES, number 96576, Hutchinson Correctional Facility, P.O. Box 1568, Hutchinson, Kansas 67504. Thank you for your time, efforts, and energy.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
This is Kevin Rashid Johnson in prison in Virginia. I wanted to express my appreciation to everyone who has been raising their voice, sending kind regard in regard to my recent diagnosis of cancer and denial of medical treatment. And I wanted to read this statement to express that, and also as an account of the situation that I'm dealing with in other political prisons also. The title of this piece is U.S. Officials Advised to Murder Political Prisoners by Medical Neglect, My Continued Denial of Cancer Care. Since receiving a recent diagnosis of prostate cancer, I've received an outpouring of love and support from a great many individuals and organizations and their supporters, including the Panther Solidarity Organization, the Revolutionary and the Communal Black Panther Party, Third World People's Alliance, Prison Radio, Prison Lives Matter, and many others too numerous to list here by name. I want to thank each and every one of you who have sent kind words and raised your voices in protest during this trying time.
where prison officials have been quite blatantly denying and delaying medical treatment in a clear ploy to ensure that my condition spreads and proves fatal. I'm of course not the first to experience this sort of attempted murder by medical neglect. It's almost the standard U.S. official response, in particular to political and politically active new African and black prisoners. Even highly visible and well-known black political prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal, Russell Maroon Schultz, and Dr. Mutula Shakur needed massive outside protest campaigns just to receive care for deadly illnesses like hepatitis C and cancer, which would have proven imminently fatal if left untreated, as U.S. officials devised. Indeed, on account of denied care, Dr. Mutula Shakur is on his deathbed as I write this, and Comrade Maroon passed on to their ancestors in December 2021. My cancer condition has similarly gone untreated. It was a year ago, in early October 2021, that blood tests showed a high likelihood that I had cancer, but Virginia prison officials did nothing for over 6 months. It wasn't until 8 months after these results were known that diagnostic tests were given, which confirmed the cancer and that it had by then spread throughout my prostate and possibly beyond. Yet it's now a year later and no treatment has been given. Even laymen know that left untreated, cancer can spread and kill in a matter of weeks to months. Contrary to the findings of international tribunals and human rights organizations, America has long denied holding hundreds of political prisoners. Not only does the U.S. hold and furthermore abuse many political prisoners who are primarily people of color, but it devises to assassinate us by medical neglect, especially when we contract potentially fatal medical conditions, which as an alternative to violent assassination offers them plausible deniability for causing our death. From outright lynching to direct and proxy assassinations like those of Fred Hampton Sr., Martin Luther King Jr., our Prentice Bunchy Carter, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and many others, America's designs to suppress and ultimately execute influential independent black political voices that organize and speak against its racism, lies, and capitalist exploitation is well established. Similarly well established is that the masses are our only real defense against these designs. In my own experience, it is to the people that I am beholden for effective resistance having been brought to bear against numerous well-documented efforts of officials to dispose of me by more traditional violent means. Now, with my cancer diagnosis, they are maneuvering to murder me by medical neglect. But I wholly trust and rely on the people, who are truly the ocean in which we revolutionaries as fish must wholly integrate ourselves and swim in order to survive. Dare to struggle, dare to win. All power to the people.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Ward Churchill, writer and activist in Atlanta, and co-author of 2 recently released books. Co-author of Agents of Repression, the FBI's Secret War Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, and co-author of the COINTELPRO Papers, documents from the FBI's secret war against dissent in the United States of America. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Ward Churchill.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, why did you produce these books?
Well, they've been reprinted. They're older. The Agents of Repression came out in 1988, initially, and COINTELPRO Papers came out 2 years later, and they remained in print into the 2000s. They've been out of print for a while. Black Classic Press decided that it was important that they be returned to circulation, so they can be had now, again, in reprint form with a new introduction from Black Classic Direct, or I suppose Amazon or your local bookstore, as the case may be. But at the point where decided to do it, my background is in the immediate sense with regard to the books, the American Indian movement. And I was heavily involved in formulating the defense, the appellate defense work with Leonard Peltier, American Indian movement. Soldier, warrior, leader, manager, whatever, various terms have been used, who is still doing 2 consecutive life sentences for the deaths in a firefight on 2 FBI agents on Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota in 1975. And you had a response from the government. This was not the first book to deal with this. Most importantly, you had Peter Matheson come out with In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, which is a 600-page study of this by a very well-respected writer. And he was immediately sued by the Attorney General of South Dakota and one of the FBI agents in the book, which tied that volume up for more than 10 years. So it was out of print, and we needed, for organizing purposes, something that went to this. So Agents of Repression, being the first, focuses heavily on the FBI's operations in the mid-1970s against, AIM, on, and around Pine Ridge. Highlights Peltier considerably, but frames those operations more broadly in the context of FBI operations against strong dissenting organizations, Black liberation movement organizations in particular, and more particularly the Black Panther Party. So we went beyond what Matheson had done, somewhat more succinctly. It was a different approach taken to the same subject matter. And you could say it was because there was nothing else available that really dealt with that. Then COINTELPRO Papers comes out because in the process of putting agents together, we come up with all kinds of additional repressive activities that the FBI had engaged in under this cryptonym that they had deployed in the mid-1950s, COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program. That was a misnomer. It was secret because it was illegal, that they were not involved in counterintelligence. They were not involved in combating the penetration of foreign national intelligence organizations in the U.S., with a possible exception at the incept. They may have been concerned with Soviet agents operating under the auspices of the Communist Party USA. And that was the original COINTELPRO in 1956. But Socialist Workers' Party, that's a Trotskyist organization, so there was no possibility of Soviet agents working within its rubric, its construction. Puerto Rican independence movement, which was taken as a target of this secret program of repression. No, there's no suggestion that they were concerned about Soviet, possibly Cuban, but not Soviet. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt on the Cuban, although in a process of penetrating and investigating and disrupting, otherwise dealing with the independence movement, they would have quickly learned that it was not functioning on the basis of instructions from a foreign power. Then you had the Black Liberation Movement, or more properly, I suppose, the Civil Rights Movement first, because Southern Christian Leadership Council was among the first targets, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also Congress of Racial Equality. All right. All of these were targeted in a range of ways for not necessarily anything to do with law enforcement. In fact, quite distinct from law enforcement, the objective stated in their internal documents and in the words of the people in charge of what was called Section 5 of the FBI, the domestic intelligence apparatus. The objective was to neutralize the target. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You can discredit them, you can cause them to be distrusted by their peers, which clearly inhibits their effectiveness in organizing. You can arrest them. You can target an organization and arrest as many members as possible, not with any anticipation necessarily of obtaining convictions, but forcing them into posting bail, hiring attorneys, mounting a defense. You can bankrupt dissident organizations that way. You can tie up their membership, and particularly their leadership, in mounting legal defense. It leaves no time for political work. You can foment hostilities between groups, within groups, through the rumor mongering, the discrediting activities I was talking about, which is usually the result of efforts by infiltrators, provocateurs. That's different from informants. They develop informants to gather intelligence, but infiltrators and provocateurs go in to disrupt and to engage in activities which, in combination with FBI propaganda efforts through friendly cooperating journalists and so forth, serve to tarnish the image of key individuals and organizations and the organizations themselves through dissemination of false information. You can do it by obtaining false convictions, extra-legal use of the judicial system, targeting, again, what they call key activists or key agitators. Or you can foment hostilities that result in deaths between groups, as was done with the Los Angeles Black Panther Party juxtaposition to, the US organization, which was called United Slaves, somewhat disparagingly in the day. That can result in fatalities, injuries, fragmentation of organizations. All those pertained in Los Angeles, but not only in Los Angeles. Happened in New Jersey. It happened other places as well. And finally, outright assassinations. Now, that can be done through surrogates, or it can be done more directly. FBI, I'm not aware of any assassination carried out directly by FBI personnel. In the cases that I would say fit this assassination scenario more officially, they deployed police entities. A criminal conspiracy section in Los Angeles, for example, that element of the police utilized its resources to effect assassinations of Butchie Carter, John Huggins, among others. And then the police themselves attempted to assassinate Geronimo Pratt when you end up with the 41st and Central firefight, the overnight, basically siege that the first SWAT team in LA laid to the Panther headquarters. Very famous incident. Pratt was not there, he was in his apartment, but they had intelligence information from Infiltrator that provided them with very specific information as to where he would be, and they didn't try to arrest him initially. They fired through the exterior wall into his bed. The one piece of information he didn't have is that Geronimo Pratt was a former paratrooper, and he had back injury that made it difficult for him to sleep in a bed. He slept on the floor beside the bed. So, 4 days, I think it was, after the assassination of Fred Hampton, Mark Clark in Chicago by a special unit of police in LA attempted to replicate that in Los Angeles with Geronimo Pratt. And Pratt was a successor to Bunchy Carter, who had been assassinated by members of the rival group, us, a year earlier. Okay. Obtaining convictions that result in extremely long sentences, life sentences, or so forth, and or assassination, clearly neutralize the target. You're dead or you're locked in a cage for, a lot of these cases now, 45, 50 years. You're permanently neutralized. You're not going to engage in politically objectionable activity at that point. But if you discredited, same result in a way. You could, I suppose, turn around and...
Let me summarize, Ward Churchill, for our audience. So you've been talking about the formation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation circa 1956 of COINTELPRO, which was this concerted effort by the U.S. government to subvert minimally different organizations, not least organizations involved in the Black liberation movement, especially the Black Panther Party.
Right.
You also mentioned that there was a criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, which operated similarly in the city of Los Angeles. You suggested that, for example, they were involved in similar disruptive activities. To your knowledge, does the criminal conspiracy section of the LAPD continue to exist? And also, what else do you have to share with our audience about the CCS?
Well, CCS was a sophisticated version of what historically has been referred to as a Red Squad. And they had considerable latitude tactically that they were allowed to exercise that went beyond normal policing. And they worked interactively with the COINTELPRO section of the Los Angeles field office of the FBI. So these are conjoint activities often. CCS, I'm not entirely sure it continues to exist or in that form under that heading. But changing a heading is not that difficult to do. And it's like in New York City, the Bureau of Strategic Services or Bureau of Special Services. I've seen it referred to even by the police under both those titles, boss, in other words. That was a comparable entity there. And it was disbanded by judicial order after a lawsuit in the early 70s. Right? But it continued to operate. It just operated under different headings and a different chain of command or command structure, using, in some cases, even the same personnel. You have that situation in Chicago. You probably have it in every major city. They don't call the Red Squad anymore. For one thing, they're not necessarily focused on people who are believed to be communist. They would focus anarchists or eco-terrorists, as they call them. People who are engaged in liberatory efforts to challenge the government, or anti-colonial, since we live in a settler state, an internal colonial structure, okay? Various colonies, American Indian reservations, American Indian peoples being probably the clearest example because of the treaty relations and so forth. But you have the original colonizing entity, the settlers who came in and constructed their own country to the exclusion of others from the get-go. Now, they've admitted others nominally over the years, but always at a disadvantage in comparison to their own position and privilege. So you have this ongoing colonial structure, okay? And then you have the colonized populations, and you have a fair number of people and organizations who have understood this to varying extents. The American Indian movement understood it, at least from one time. Black Panther Party understood it. Revolutionary Action Movement understood it. The Republic of New Africa understood it. Ivor Kuhn understood it. You know, we can keep ticking them off. Certainly the Puerto Ricanos and the independence movement understood Puerto Rico to be a colony. So you've got this sort of combat that's going on. And it's become very fashionable to say, you know, well, on the one side, you've got the federal authorities, and on the other side, you've got these radicals or revolutionaries, and both sides are violent, and there's an equivalence there. No, there's not. Colonial violence is illegal under international law. Decolonizing violence is a right under international law. Now, we can parse all that, but there's a fundamental distinction to be drawn between those who use arms to defend themselves as their communities against the armed force of the colonizer on the one hand, and those who wield the weapons in behalf of colonial dominance on the other. Totally different. So we need to understand that in the history of how this has gone down.
Well, Ward Churchill, I'm afraid that we're at the end of our time here, but I'd like to thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles. Ward Churchill, writer and activist in Atlanta, co-author of the books Agents of Repression, the FBI's Secret War Against the Black Panther Party and the American Indian Movement, and co-author of the COINTELPRO Papers, documents from the FBI's Secret War Against Dissent in the United States. Thank you once again for joining us on KPFK Freedom Now, Los Angeles.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Kehinde Andrews, Ward Churchill. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Brother Brandon Sankara, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, our board ops, Brother Wendell, Brother Yao, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our Sister Assumpta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. This program can be reheard for the next 60 days. You can go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Signing off, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.